Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Student Resistance in the Age of Chaos, Book 1, 1999 through 2009. Globalization, Human Rights, Religion, War, and the Age of the Internet. By Mark Edelman Boren. Narrated by Timothy Andrés Pabon. Preface. April 20th, 2019. Notre Dame Cathedral was still smoldering when I arrived in Paris, and this afternoon, a week later, other parts of Paris would be on fire. The day had begun for me as typically as any other that week, with research in the morning, though the location for my déjeuner, a recommended sidewalk cafe several blocks removed from the Place de la République, was not among my usual haunts. 5 streets came together before the cafe, and as in most such establishments, the tables and chairs faced outward, giving diners a lovely panorama of the ornate buildings topped with steep slate roofs that lined the streets. It was Saturday. The weather was absolutely beautiful, and the area was bustling. The spot was on the right bank, in the eastern part of the city, some distance from the Sorbonne, near where I was based, but I had been alerted to come here by students who were planning to protest the government's attempt to raise tuition fees for foreign students attending university. Their group would be but one faction of what they described as a formidable Gilets jaunes, yellow vests demonstration to occur that afternoon. As I waited and enjoyed a double espresso and plateau de fromage, people in brightly colored vests began to walk past, and soon one heard chanting in the distance. I had attended a Gilets jaunes march immediately following the burning of Notre Dame, and it had been a relatively calm affair, nothing at all like the previous month's riots on the Champs-Élysées. The combination of crisp air and sun on this day couldn't have been more delightful, and I thought I would enjoy my repast and then leisurely walk down to snap some pictures of protesters, take notes, and interview demonstrators and police. This was, after all, Paris, and even given recent tussles between police and demonstrators, my expectations for how the day's events would unfold were admittedly different from those I'd held for protests I witnessed in Guatemala, where social unrest was controlled by armed federal police and military units wielding automatic rifles. And although I may have rinsed some clothes that morning in the sink of my hotel room, with its balcony overlooking the Pantheon, I was not in clothes laundered in a Central American lake. As I finished my Camembert de Normandie, the distant chanting changed in both tempo and intensity, and I thought it time to try to catch the server's eye and signal for the bill. That was when the unmistakable wee-wah of French police sirens suddenly filled the streets, and half a dozen blue and white cars with flashing lights sped through the intersection and down the street, the echoes of their sirens reverberating down the canyon of buildings. These smaller cars were immediately followed by a wailing caravan of 8 giant dark blue police transports coming from the same direction, though they veered off and disappeared down another route. A massive armored police tank surmounted by 2 remote-controlled water cannons rumbled past. I forsook my receipt, and without any hope of claiming my per diem reimbursement, dumped a pocketful of euros on the table and stepped out onto the sidewalk. More police vehicles flew past, and 2 others screeched to a halt in the intersection, completed quick 3-point turns, and sealed it off. Traffic on the 3 streets to the left was immediately jammed, and angry drivers began honking. It was the day before Easter Sunday, and the Gilets jaunes had orchestrated the simultaneous occupation of key metro stations across the city, bringing the entire city of Paris to a standstill. They set fire to vehicles, Vespas, and barricades in targeted locations to shut down all the trains at once, and to underscore that the government faced immediate problems other than the restoration of a burned landmark. The demonstration at the Place de la République, a few blocks from where I stood, would in short order escalate into the most violent uprising Paris had seen in some time, with masked rioters throwing pavers and flares at riot police, who repeatedly charged them with batons. The protesters were enraged that €1 billion had, in only a matter of days, been donated by wealthy tycoons and corporations for the restoration of Notre Dame, the pledges being viewed by the protesters as offensive brand-raising PR stunts, while the poor of France continued to suffer economic hardship. Yes, they wanted the cathedral restored, but they also wanted economic justice. Demonstrators at the protests carried signs saying things like, "Must I set myself on fire to get the government's attention?" and shouted, "Give us our money back, and we'll rebuild our cathedral." Many would be injured in the riots, and more than 200 protesters arrested. Storefront windows would be smashed, cars and motorcycles would be vandalized, and the smoke of burning vehicles would mix with tear gas to choke the air for blocks around. One part of the group would try to force a march to Notre Dame itself, only to be repelled by security troops. Unknown to the tourists coming to the city that weekend, 60,000 police had been mobilized in anticipation of the day's demonstrations, which in Paris alone drew close to 10,000 participants. Across France, another 20,000 demonstrated, in some cases violently. Police I interviewed in the days prior only knew that they had been deployed to maintain order, to prevent vandalism, and to keep people from getting hurt. This was a classic maneuver in the modern counter-demonstration playbook. Police were brought in from outlying areas, so they would have no personal connection to locals or to the neighborhoods to which they were assigned. Those I had spoken with had been courteous, friendly, and generous, middle-class professionals, many with families at home doing their jobs. But they also made it clear that when challenged by protesters, they would push back. That Saturday, some of them would be firing tear gas grenades and water cannons at their fellow citizens, and others would be taking part in baton charges, resorting to beating the anarchists and provocateurs among the protesters, who escalated the conflict by hurling bricks and stones, as well as others who happened to get in the way. Even hesitating on the periphery of the Place de la République, as I was doing at the moment, was not safe. As the sounds of fighting increased from down the avenue to my right, a crush of people began fleeing the area on foot. Personal motorcycles and scooters zipped crazily, even for Paris, back up the blocked-off streets, past the police barricades, and through crowds of curious onlookers. All this happened in the first minutes of the conflict. The yelling grew louder, along with the unmistakable sounds of physical violence. More sirens, a different kind, I noted, wailed from my left, accompanied by the high-pitched whine of speed bikes. Parisian bystanders, knowing what was coming, drew back toward the walls of buildings as 20 police motorcycles suddenly appeared in rapid succession, weaving at stunning speed through the jammed cars beyond the barricades to scream past the cafe one after the other, flying in the direction of the protest. Slaloming through parked cars, around medians, over sidewalks, and in and out through iron lampposts and signs, they shot between the bumpers of the police car blockade and roared by in a serpentine line, as if the entire formation was a giant snake racing through the cars and obstacles. At incredible speed, each bike trailed the one ahead by only a meter or so, maintaining precise formation and speed, with absolute faith in the path chosen by the lead bike. This, then, was the modern solution to the problem of rapid troop movement in the city, and a much more stylish one than Haussmann's. Fleets of strategically placed, low-slung motorcycles, each one surmounted by 2 shock troops, a driver and another clutching him from behind, all in modish, matching black clothes, on black motorcycles, as if they were in some Tarantino remake of Tron, a rapid response that delivered 40 superbly trained reinforcements to the scene of a riot in midday traffic through the narrow streets of Paris in mere seconds. Of all the protests I've witnessed in my travels and research for this book that I could have used as an introductory example, some larger, some more violent, I chose this one because not only did it include a traditional march and bodies on the barricades aspect, But it also suggested how much technology and shifting tactics will play a role in the future of activism. While media coverage focuses on the rock throwing, the tear gas, and the fires, technology is changing both activist strategies and police response. That day, the protesters' overall strategy began with a decentralized social networking organization of the protests that allowed the Gilets jaunes to avoid tipping off the police they knew were monitoring them. Informing people of the coming demonstrations to get protesters ready for day of instructions to follow was done via both websites and social media, but the most sensitive information about the specific locations of demonstrations and who would go where and do what was sent to those on standby through encrypted chat lines. When they struck, they did so at multiple locations at once with flash mobs. Organizers sent sub-networks, such as the faction of communist students from the Sorbonne, to specific locations, suggesting needed numbers and needed supplies, and released real-time tactical instructions, the setting of small fires, for example, near key train stations, to effectively sow confusion and paralyze the city's metro. Thus, when the demonstration began, police would have to scramble to multiple locations and spread out their personnel. Knowing media coverage would be intense, organizers co-opted the symbol of fire from the burning of Notre Dame as a theme of the protests. This allowed them simultaneously to draw attention to economic disparity and to criticize the government's policies. The image of fire appeared on a great many of the signs and banners protesters created ahead of time, and thus the fires set throughout the city by protesters were folded into a larger conversation about and critique of government policies in the media. At the same time, the police response revealed authorities were both using traditional countermeasures, importing troops in overwhelming numbers, and applying new technologies, including cyber surveillance, which alerted security forces to the coming demonstrations and picked up enough social media and online chatter to tell them, if not specifics regarding how and where the protests would be launched, at least how big they likely would be, and how many troops they'd need. They then stationed troops near likely sites throughout the city. New tactics, aerial surveillance, and dedicated telecommunication strategies allowed for real-time reconnaissance to discern where reinforcements were needed through both troop reports and surveillance tracking crowd movements, and facilitate quick conventional responses, the street blockades, and the deployment of troop carriers and water cannons. They enabled the use of the futuristic rapid response motorcycle columns to deploy additional reinforcements where needed. Well before the protests, police had spent time developing urban-capable, heavily armored water cannon tanks that could not be breached by demonstrators, which clearly were capable of driving over street barricades and stalled vehicles. Each tank was surmounted with multiple remote-controlled water cannons, which could be safely operated from within the vehicle's sealed cab behind the protection of shatterproof, bulletproof glass. Of course, on the side of security, technological innovations included everything from the tear gas used, intense but rapidly dissipating, to the design of body armor, batons, and transparent full-body shields. There were also those guns that fired rubber-coated bullets intended to incapacitate but not permanently harm. These new measures were all backed up, should things get out of hand, by conventionally armed security forces with semi-automatic weapons. Thus, security forces were deploying sophisticated intelligence operations and had developed a series of response levels and tactics of increasingly firm suppression. Police troops were trained to be firm but restrained. On this day, they used a lot of tear gas, but there was not widespread beating of protesters. The idea was to control unrest but not widen support for the movement, which could happen if they were filmed hurting people, and the media had clearly been made aware of the demonstrations to come by protest organizers. heavily armed squads of police, similar to those seen in French airports, were deployed in close proximity to the events, ready should they be needed, but held back from the conflict as much as possible. There would be no martyrs to the cause of the Gilets jaunes. Groups of police stationed in clumps across Paris, who were not tasked with stopping protesters, remained friendly toward citizens and tourists, indulgently posing for selfies, and pleasant toward people wearing neon vests who were clearly on their way to or from protests. The demonstrators I interviewed before and after the protests were also personable and took time to explain their positions. Security would undoubtedly analyze surveillance footage in the days to come and seek to identify and arrest participants who had set fires, were violent, or otherwise destroyed property. But everyone involved in the actions seemed acutely aware that they were under constant surveillance by police, media, protesters with cameras, and bystanders with phones. How people comported themselves would inevitably become part of the messaging by both sides. The protest and countermeasures were thus a complex political physical media event, one that would be represented, narrated, and interpreted for days and years afterwards. It was also a harbinger of the future of demonstration and counter-demonstration strategies, tactics, and technologies. Complicating this careful dance between the forces of protesters and security was always the threat of anarchists, provocateurs, or unrelated groups that might seek opportune moments to strike other targets in the city or escalate the violence at demonstrations to capture the attention of the media. Back to the motorbikes. As quickly as they had appeared, the piggybacking squad of Special Forces bikers flew past me again in rapid succession. Voom, 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 20 of them, to disappear down the now empty street, their bikes screaming as they raced toward another flashpoint in the growing conflict, leaving behind stunned bystanders in the intersection, in a state of terrified awe to have witnessed them. I and two locals, who were clearly trying to make it to their apartments halfway down the block before the expanding riot could cut them off, slipped past the police blockade and hurried down the empty sidewalk toward the increasing sounds of chaos. Introduction. Student resistance drives social evolution. This book documents a constant, often spontaneous, worldwide struggle of idealism and change against powers of social control and stasis, a multi-front, multi-issue battle that over the past 2 decades has been waged in both new and old forms in every nation on Earth between youth aspiring to power and older generations trying to keep it for themselves. Hundreds of thousands of student resistance actions have occurred since the start of the new millennium, from strikes to marches, petitions to bombings, single defiant stands against injustice to massive social media-driven boycotts. The sheer number of actions and their effects on the course of societies and cultures confirm that in today's modern world, student resistance is defining of, or an integral part of, the evolution of every society in existence today. The myth that the heyday of student activism was in the past, in the 1960s and 70s, is a fiction. Globally, no period has seen more student activism than the past 20 years, and the process has been accelerating. The amount of student activism in the world more or less doubled from the first decade to the second decade of the new millennium, and by all accounts, the future holds more. Since the beginning of the 21st century, the world has increasingly been enveloped in turmoil, if not outright chaos. Authoritarianism has been on the rise, alliances between nations have been weakened or shattered, and war and famine have caused massive human migrations, internment camps, slavery, and violence against large groups of people are mundane facts of life, even within developed nations, while many of those in charge of those nations pretend it is not happening. The leaders of nuclear-armed countries have repeatedly challenged and threatened one another, and in 2016, an unpredictable and wholly self-absorbed television personality with no government experience, took the reins of the most powerful nation on earth, appointing cronies and corrupt officials to key posts, and plunging the world into 4 years of confusion and instability. While geopolitical and economic storms continue to rage, the planet itself is threatened by pollution and climate change. The stakes for the future of Earth and humankind have never been higher than they are today. Enter the student. She embodies a paradox, having been taught knowledge and strategies for success, but also the idea that to gain and accept new knowledge, she must challenge preconceptions, prior beliefs, and authority, the received knowledge of the past. This questing, this cultivation of a why this and not that disposition, makes education, personal development, social growth, and innovation possible. But sooner or later it also may turn her against the forces that control students and their respective societies. Combined with her youthful idealism and the fact that, as is the case with many students, she isn't yet economically or professionally invested enough for opponents or authorities to use leverage to stop her from protesting, she may risk physical suppression and expulsion, but doesn't yet have a family to support or a career to protect. Many students use their newfound awareness, education, and independence to challenge the status quo. The student, in her nature, is a political creature, learning to be adept at negotiating channels of power in order to accumulate more power, knowledge, position, status, money, technology, things, and more than a few begin to chafe at the restraints of their societies. Although social activism is certainly not limited to students or the young, the conditions that make for creative, aware, knowledgeable, and socially involved students are also perfect for subsequently inducing them to become social activists. This is why education is often perceived as inherently threatening to conservative forces of authority, and why student activism in the modern world is a perennial threat to repressive societies. In times when social and political chaos reigns, when widespread human suffering is clearly evident, when so many resources are available and so many of them wasted, when extremes in human nature come to the fore, when injustice is rampant, and the divide between the haves and the have-nots is great, students are more likely to challenge their societies and raise up their heads and their fists. Granted, not all students fight for altruistic reasons. Witness the recent rise of alt-right student groups in the United States, Germany, Hungary, or Poland, and violent traditionalist student groups in India. But student activists of every sort believe they are fighting for positive social change and against perceived social or governmental threats. Their belief in their causes and the de facto martial context make for a volatile mixture, and since the deck is always stacked against protesters, they do not have well-trained, armed security forces with conflict experience and tactics based on known demonstration practices on their side. Students must constantly invent new ways to challenge authority. Usually physically, financially, and legally disadvantaged from the start in their quest, they increasingly resort to guerrilla-style tactics, even if they are carried out through peaceful or legal means, trying to stay one step ahead of more powerful opponents and police. They must constantly open new fronts against entrenched power before stronger physical responses can be launched against them. And when they do march in force, they characteristically try to spark larger movements before administrations or governments can assert control or counterattack with direct, overwhelming physical force. In terms of social power, the struggle between the forces of change and forces of stasis is what defines all of our societies, and it is what forces societies to evolve or to entrench and calcify. In this context, student and youth resistance drives social evolution. Student activism is many centuries old and has always been political in nature. Indeed, the first universities were coalitions of student scholars who hired teachers and used collective power to extort concessions from local businesses and towns, and since the Middle Ages, students have repeatedly increased their power and influence on their societies through social, political, and physical engagement with ruling authorities. The types of resistance actions student activists have fashioned are incredibly varied, and while some never rose above fights for personal entitlements or beyond beer-fueled town-and-gown riots, others have sparked dramatic social changes, reformulated national political structures, fomented revolutions, and started or stopped wars. But the last 25 or so years have seen student resistance actions different in kind and magnitude from those at any other time in history. This is due to radical changes in technology and the sophistication of networking, information dissemination, and protest methods through the internet and social media, coupled with widespread geopolitical chaos and a rampant reformulation of national and international power structures throughout the world. What makes this particular moment in time unique, and what makes this book necessary and even possible, are tremendous technological changes. The access common people now have to information, tactics, images, news, and each other. New tools and strategies available for resistance have augmented traditional protest actions and armed a dizzying number of student resistance movements. The use of phone-driven flash mobbing, the ability to connect with and mobilize thousands, even millions, through the internet and cell phones, the ability to record video on phones and immediately transmit images and events internationally, have all put tremendous power in the hands of common people. And more governmental reliance on computer technology has given sophisticated hackers new government targets. Yet the prolific cyberlinking of activists has also awarded technologically sophisticated governments access to entire networks of opposition groups, identified potential targets for arrest, and let authorities monitor movements of individuals. Our phones track us, our televisions and computers listen to and watch us, and in cities and transportation hubs, we are constantly scanned by facial recognition software. Satellites and drones observe us from above, and following protests, images of crowds, even when they number in the tens of thousands, are processed through software, face by face, to identify participants. Lists are drawn up, targets are tagged for future surveillance, and in many cases, arrests are made. In conjunction with a rash of new and intentionally vague anti-terrorist laws adopted in almost every country in the world in the last 10 years, such anti-opposition tools repeatedly have been used to stamp out even moderate opposition, and have served up political networks and opponents to authoritarian regimes. The already central role that technology plays in the perennial battle between activists and entrenched authority, between the forces of change and the forces of repression, only continues to grow. This 2-volume project details student protest actions and technological changes of the last few decades, fleshing out their immediate historical context and their effects upon their societies and the world. It identifies major trends and trajectories. While the scope and details may seem overwhelming at times, describing them and doing so in some detail is necessary for the listener to realize how incredibly pervasive and important resistance actions have been globally in recent years, and at the same time, how violent the forces of oppression are today throughout the world. Out of the details, pictures and trends emerge, as does a better understanding of what is at stake in these human struggles. The extensive documentation of sexual violence brought to light by protests in India, for example, can be soul-crushing, but without seeing their extent and understanding their context, one cannot fully grasp the importance of the protests in 2019, in which millions of women stood together to form a 300-mile-long human wall in India, courageously demanding an end to sexual violence. The protest would not have been possible without the technology-driven dissemination and discussion of incidents of sexual violence, the context of the #MeToo movement, and the ability through social media to announce the demonstration quickly. In addition to the relevance of historical context, one cannot overstate the importance of the role technology plays in activism today. In comparing maps of student resistance...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?